for over 70 years, since the guns fell silent in Korea in 1953. America's dominance in the air has been our ace in the hole. No enemy has inhibited our military from the sky, ensuring that our forces, whether on the land, sea, or air, have the freedom to maneuver, fight, and win. American air power has made the U.S. military the envy of the world, until now. Because they know that it's our asymmetric advantage, China is doing everything it can to dismantle America's capabilities in air and space, and they've got Russia, Iran, and North Korea riding shotgun. Their mission is clear: destroy American air power. Their HQ-9 and HQ-19 surface-to-air missile systems match Russia's S-400 and S-500 SAMs, and with ranges up to 200 nautical miles, these threats can be lethal to anything but the most stealthy and advanced combat aircraft. In the air, it's worse. Chinese PL-17 air-to-air missiles boast a range of 300 miles, far outranging America's most advanced AIM-120D AMRAAMs. China's J-20 and new J-35 fighter jets are designed to take on U.S. F-22s and F-35s, and China has revealed the development of two more next-generation advanced fighters, the J-36 and the J-50. Although the U.S. Air Force announced the award of its newest fighter, the F-47, it may be over a decade before this aircraft is operational. And the U.S. Air Force is buying less than 50 new fighters a year, while China's People's Liberation Army Air Forces is producing well over 100 new combat aircraft annually. Their fighter jets are newer than America's, averaging less than 10 years, while the average age of U.S. fighters is over 30. And their pilots fly more, averaging over 200 hours a year, while American fighter pilots fly only 130. China is pursuing a qualitative and quantitative advantage. China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea are all hacking American networks, increasingly employing artificial intelligence to mount attacks of incomprehensible speed and volume. In space, where America has long held unique advantages, China and Russia are fielding a variety of anti-satellite weapons, from direct descent missiles to lasers, and even nuclear explosives in space. On Earth, Chinese missiles threaten U.S. air bases and aircraft carriers in the Pacific. Russia and Iran are collaborating on weapons. China is helping to arm Iran, North Korea, and Venezuela. And North Korea's nukes, tested again in 2024, threaten America's allies and Pacific bases. Just 3 decades ago, American air power was unparalleled throughout the world. But 30 years of underinvestment, deferred and canceled modernization, and forced downsizing has allowed China and its allies to catch up. Without overwhelming air power, our forces and interests are at risk, and this can embolden our adversaries. Today, the U.S. Air Force is the oldest, smallest, and least ready it has ever been in its history. And it is on track to get even older, smaller, and less ready in the future. But it does not have to be this way. We must commit to the increased budgets and resources required to halt this decline and reverse the force structure nosedive that the Air Force is in. Because in the race for air and space supremacy, second place is not an option.
And it's my pleasure to moderate this discussion tonight. I'll be introducing our speaker, and we'll have our discussion. Before I start, many of you may know that Lieutenant General Dick Carey passed away last week. General Carey was a fixture of the community, icon in the local Marine community. Made his bones at Chosin Reservoir, Silver Star, and probably most well known for his, he was the commander of the 9th Marine Aviation Brigade for the evacuation of Saigon, April 30th, 1975, which in 2 days will commemorate the 50th anniversary of that. It's we had hoped he would be there with us. We think he'll be there in spirit, and we'll honor him more at that event. So please continue your meal and dessert. I want to start with letting you know what's coming up here. You know, we're right now exploring this great power competition and national strategy. We'll have the air power piece of that tonight. We're going to continue with that theme through the fall. You know, it's sort of driven by the fact that the president of China, has said, by 2049, I want China to be the predominant military and economic power in the world. So the question is, how do we as a country respond to that? How do we develop our strategy, and how do we develop the force structure to respond to that for the next 25 years? 25 years may seem like a long time, but if you think about it, that's the amount of time it took the F-35 to get from the drawing board to the flight line. So if we're going to respond to that with force structure, the time to start is right now. So we'll never answer all those questions in one program, but we have some programs we're looking at down the road to get pieces of that. The next program will be on the 26th of October. That's actually 2 programs down the road. Admiral Mike Manzier will be our speaker, a quite entertaining guy, and he will talk about sea power and great power competition. In between, on the 27th of July, we'll take a look at the other pieces of the adversary puzzle, the axis of resistance, Russia, China, and Iran, with 2 experts from the Institute for the Studies of War, Joanna Moore and Christina Harvard. We have subject matters from ISW to talk about some of the Russia futures and potentially the Middle East. The timing of some of these programs may vary a little bit depending on the availability of speakers, but we take them when we can get them, and we're really fortunate to have caught General Deptula tonight on his swing through the region. So I want to introduce our speaker. I've known General Dave Deptula for decades. We both grew up in the Air Force F-15 community. We were at many of the same bases, although I don't think we were ever actually stationed together at the same time. Dave was a superb fighter pilot. It was either a case of being in the right place at the right time or the wrong place at the right time. But when Operation Desert Storm started, he was taken off to Saudi Arabia to help design and run the air campaign for Desert Storm, for General Chuck Horner, which many people think was probably the most successful and well-run air campaign in the history of warfare. With a reputation established as one of the foremost thinkers about the application of air power, he became the guy in the Air Force who got the call when our government dealt with the really hard issues and policy issues important to the future of our country. And his name has been on many of the foundational documents for the last 20 years. He has over 3,000 hours in high-performance aircraft, including 100 combat hours, and his last assignment was as the first Air Force Chief of Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance, where he transformed America's military and drone enterprise into a warfighter-focused organization. He retired after years of service and subsequently established and now serves as Dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies in Washington, probably our most respected and think tank focused on air power. And they have an excellent podcast series if you need something to do while you're driving across Texas. They're fascinating discussions. As I said, we were fortunate to catch Dave on a swing through the region and convinced him to come visit us. Dave, thanks for all of us who have known you and appreciate what you do for the Air Force and the Joint Force. In just a minute, I'll turn the stage over to you for your remarks. As always, we will have our Q&A session at the end of this. And, we try to let this thing go on as long as the questions are good. We've never run out of questions. Unfortunately, we never get to all of them. But think about your questions. There are 3 ways you could ask questions. One is you can send a question to that email address. You can also write it down, and there should be a 3x5 card on each table. Write it down, and we'll have someone collect it and bring it up. And finally, at the end, if we have time, we'll do direct Q&A from the audience. If you want to ask a question, hold your hand up. We'll get you a microphone. Wait till you have a microphone because we're videotaping this, and we want to get your question. So, Dave, with that introduction, we thank you for being here. I'll turn it over to you. Dave, welcome General Deptula.
Well, I like to wander around. Thanks very much, General Campbell, for that introduction. And to all of you, it's a real pleasure and a privilege to be here tonight. I am acutely aware that this is an audience made up of soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. And do we have any guardians in the crowd? Maybe not yet. But a thoroughly joint audience. And quite frankly, while I'm going to be speaking to you about the status, the current state of our Air Force and Space Force, I do that from the context of its importance as part of our entire joint doctrine and manner in which we operate. One of the things that I had the very good fortune to do while I was on active duty, and it's relatively unusual for Air Force officers, but I was a Joint Task Force commander twice, and had the opportunity to serve with soldiers, sailor, airmen, and Marines in combat, getting shot at, and it's a wonderful combination, and it's why I believe, as I get more and more senior, even more in the utility of our joint approach to operations. So that means that we need to have, and I believe we need to have, the strongest Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, Space Force in the world to make it all right. Because it provides the option for a Joint Task Force commander, whoever he or she may be, to select the right composition of service expertise to meet the needs of a particular contingency situation, and they're all very, very different. So just because one might not operate a lot, I mean, joint means using the right force at the right place at the right time. It doesn't mean using every force, every place, all the time. But it's important for all of you, actually it's important for all of us to understand just where we are. So that's what I'm going to talk about today with respect to the Air Force and the Space Force. It's nothing magic. Here's kind of the nominal overview for you. We're going to start with threats, which I don't know if people even understand today how significant they are. That's okay. Oh, okay, sorry. And then I'll give you some, I'm not just going to give you the problems, I'm going to give you some solutions too. And the bottom line in the context of what it's going to take to meet those solutions. So let's start out with the threat. You all can read faster than I can say the words, but back in last year, the National Defense Strategy Commission identified the fact that the threats that are facing us today are perhaps the most significant since the end of World War II. I'd tell you, I'd modify that a bit. In fact, the threats facing us today are the greatest that we've ever faced in our history as a nation. And it's just getting worse. Now, I've got a little bit of a video, it's not too long, to give you a little more insight into just what particular threats are facing the Air Force and the Space Force. So let me see if I can get that running now, and then we'll come back to the presentation.
For over 70 years, since the guns fell silent in Korea in 1953, America's dominance in the air has been our ace in the hole. No enemy has inhibited our military from the sky, ensuring that our forces, whether on the land, sea, or air, have the freedom to maneuver, fight, and win. American air power has made the U.S. military the envy of the world, until now. Because they know that it's our asymmetric advantage, China is doing everything it can to dismantle America's capabilities in air and space, and they've got Russia, Iran, and North Korea riding shotgun. Their mission is clear: destroy American air power. Their HQ-9 and HQ-19 surface-to-air missile systems match Russia's S-400 and S-500 SAMs, and with ranges up to 200 nautical miles, these threats can be lethal to anything but the most stealthy and advanced combat aircraft. In the air, it's worse. Chinese PL-17 air-to-air missiles boast a range of 300 miles, far outranging America's most advanced AIM-120D AMRAAMs. China's J-20 and new J-35 fighter jets are designed to take on U.S. F-22s and F-35s, and China has revealed the development of two more next-generation advanced fighters, the J-36 and the J-50. Although the U.S. Air Force announced the award of its newest fighter, the F-47, it may be over a decade before this aircraft is operational, And the U.S. Air Force is buying less than 50 new fighters a year, while China's People's Liberation Army Air Forces is producing well over 100 new combat aircraft annually. Their fighter jets are newer than America's, averaging less than 10 years, while the average age of U.S. fighters is over 30. And their pilots fly more, averaging over 200 hours a year, while American fighter pilots fly only 130. China is pursuing a qualitative and quantitative advantage. China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea are all hacking American networks, increasingly employing artificial intelligence to mount attacks of incomprehensible speed and volume. In space, where America has long held unique advantages, China and Russia are fielding a variety of anti-satellite weapons, from direct descent missiles to lasers, and even nuclear explosives in space. On Earth, Chinese missiles threaten U.S. air bases and aircraft carriers in the Pacific. Russia and Iran are collaborating on weapons. China is helping to arm Iran, North Korea, and Venezuela. And North Korea's nukes, tested again in 2024, threaten America's allies and Pacific bases. Just 3 decades ago, American air power was unparalleled throughout the world. But 30 years of underinvestment, deferred and canceled modernization, and forced downsizing has allowed China and its allies to catch up. Without overwhelming air power, our forces and interests are at risk, and this can embolden our adversaries. Today, the U.S. Air Force is the oldest, smallest, and least ready it has ever been in its history. And it is on track to get even older, smaller, and less ready in the future. But it does not have to be this way. We must commit to the increased budgets and resources required to halt this decline and reverse the force structure nosedive that the Air Force is in. Because in the race for air and space supremacy, second place is not an option.
Okay, well, I think most of you are aware of the significance of the threats. Now, I wasn't aware until earlier today that General Burr and Barbara were going to be here today. General Burr, the last time I saw him was Colonel Burr, and I was Captain Deptula. And we were flying F-15s. And I'm just curious what your impression is with an air-to-air missile that the adversary has that can go 300 miles. When at the time, you know, we're dealing with missiles that ranged 20, 30 miles max. We can do a little bit better than that today, too. The bottom line is these threats, where 20, 30 years ago they weren't threats at all, are now coming up to the point where they can really match our capabilities. But I think all of us here are pragmatic as well, and we realize that there are fiscal realities and political realities in combination with the threats that hopefully are getting the Department of Defense to drive home with laser focus. They need to look at things and prioritize what matters. And there are a list of some of the options up there that the department is looking at. The challenge is, from an Air Force perspective, as you might have heard, and I apologize, it was a little bit quiet there in the video, your Air Force today is the oldest, the smallest, and the least ready it's ever been in its 77-year history. Now think about that for a minute. We're coming up on 78. Oldest, smallest, and least ready ever. At the same time, the Chinese are the newest, the largest, and the most ready in their history. Now, some of my active duty friends take this as a criticism. I go, it's not a criticism, it's a fact. Don't take it personally, all right? Because this isn't the consequence of a particular administration. It's occurred over the last 30 years, regardless of who's in power. And, you know, it didn't happen with malice of forethought. But if you go back to the end of the Cold War, what was everyone looking for? A peace dividend. The great big ugly bear went away, right? And so we went from design inventories for the B-2, the world's most capable advanced stealthy bomber, from 132 down to 20. And then we were able to scrape up a test aircraft, so we had 21. But we lost 2 along the way, so now we have 19. You got 6 of them today in Diego Garcia. given maintenance, given age, that's about the max you're going to get out of a 19 aircraft fleet. We had a design inventory level of F-22 at 750. We ended up buying 186. It's not like Air Force leadership didn't have a plan. They did have a recapitalization plan, and then along came 9/11. And what happened? We had to reorient our focus, and priorities changed. And as a result of that focus, the United States Army ended up receiving $1.3 trillion more than the Air Force in the 20 years post 9/11. Now, for those of you who aren't math majors, that's an average of $65 billion a year more than the Air Force. Now, I don't begrudge the Army that money, because you all who served in the Army and the Marine Corps were the preponderance of forces in those conflicts. Okay, but guess what? We're no longer in Iraq or Afghanistan. So give us our money back, because we need to rebuild our Air Force. I say that with a bit of humor, but hey, we were able to shift $65 billion a year to you guys when you needed it. We need to rebuild our Air Force. Some of the challenges are that because of the demands on fiscal budgets, the Air Force is programmed to get even older and smaller and less ready over the next 5 years. And the real elephant in the room is there's no plan to recover. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to brief everything on this chart. It kind of looks like an Army chart. You know, they fill it up with words and numbers. But if you look at all those aircraft over the right, which make up the majority of the aircraft in the Air Force inventory, now we'll explain the numbers over there on the right with the A-10 example. 43 years is the average age of the A-10. 72 is when it first flew. It's 53 years old since that first flight, and there's 261 of them. So let me summarize the chart. 10 of those aircraft types had their first flight over 50 years ago. Those 10 types make up over 2,600 aircraft in today's Air Force force structure. 2,600 aircraft who first flew over 50 years ago. Now, to put that in perspective, and I know I have some Navy friends out here, the United States Navy has one ship on active duty that's over 50 years old. And it's not the Constitution. I gave him a spot on that one. It's actually the Blue Ridge. It's stationed out in Japan. Okay, so while all the services to a degree are suffering some modernization problems, no one's suffering as much as the Air Force is. Last week we celebrated the 73rd birthday of the first flight of the B-52. I can remember that because it's the same birthday as mine. So I'm getting on up there too. The week before that, we celebrated the 66th anniversary of the aircraft that is currently today the Air Force's most modern trainer. And those Air Force people in here who grew up and got checked out on it, it's the T-38. The only problem is that we've had to ground 2 squadrons of them because the parts manufacturers no longer exist to keep the engines in them viable. So, you know, while we've been on pause for the last 30 plus years, the rest of the world hasn't, particularly China. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to spend a lot of time explaining all these numbers. I don't have to. Just look at the color of the bar charts and the size of them. They're going down. 4,300, over 4,300 fighters in '89 in the Cold War time frame to 724 available today. You think that's bad? Look at this chart on bombers. What I'll remind you of is this is the entirety of the free world's bomber force. There is no other nation that has bombers. All right? And by the way, we can generate, applying current mission capable rates, about 54 bombers. That means you can get out there and start them up. It doesn't necessarily mean each one of them are going to take off because there's going to be some sort of maintenance issue. All right. This chart, I put together some data from Air Combat Command to do a comparison from where we were in 1991 when we fought Operation Desert Storm, which was the last major regional conflict the United States participated in, and where we are today. And if you look at the numbers over there on the left, that's total number of fighter aircraft. We're almost 60% less in terms of numbers of squadrons of fighter aircraft that we have today. For the aviators in the room, the middle column is really going to disturb you. Because back in '91, we averaged over 22 flying hours a month. That's about 3 times a week, given 1.1, 1.2 hour average flying sortie duration. Today, it's less than 10. Folks, when I was a young captain flying F-15s in Kadena Air Base in Japan, we used to joke about the Russians and the Chinese and the Koreans flying less than 10 hours a month. And here we are. General Jumper, a former chief of staff that many of you know, used to use a comparison to highlight the significance and the importance of our training by saying that, and this is around 2001 time frame, 2002, you could put a U.S. pilot in a crummy substandard Chinese jet and a Chinese pilot in a top-of-the-line U.S. jet, and the U.S. pilot is kick his ass every time. Because it's training, it's competence, it's the ability to handle the aircraft that makes a difference. And now we are in the position, and you saw, if you were paying attention to the video, we're flying about, it depends, but just over 100 hours a month. The Chinese have exceeded us, and now they're flying over 200 hours a month. Not a month, a year. But readiness is incredibly important. And then, of course, we're 3 times older. Around the turn of the millennia, I happened to be in charge of the Air Force's Quadrennial Defense Review. I can remember sitting in a session with then Chief of Staff General Mike Ryan and the Air Force programmer, the person who makes sure where all the money is going. And they were lamenting the fact that the average age of our fighter force back then was about 12 years. And the world was going to end if it got to be 15 years. And now we're over 30 in terms of average aircraft. That was squadrons. This is a comparison in terms of actual numbers of fighters and bombers. You can see how they're down over 50. Tankers, they're only down 22. That's because we haven't built any new tankers. Ladies and gentlemen, the KC-135 was first procured in the Eisenhower administration. And we're still flying them, and we're forecast to be flying them, someone told me the other day, until 20's right, no, 2075. So we're going to be flying airplanes that are over 100 years old. Okay, I think I made my point. Back to readiness, because I'm going to talk to you in a bit about the fact that we have a perennial 2,000-person pilot shortage. But even if you could magically make those 2,000 pilots appear, we don't have the airplanes to put them in. Not only that, as our fleets get older and older, they get less and less available. At any given time, the United States Air Force has over 700 aircraft grounded due to lack of spare parts. How many of you out there have a 1961 Buick LeSabre? Okay, well, it's sort of a joke, but I gave this presentation to the American Legion Convention in Washington. And believe it or not, there are 2 folks that went, yeah, I got one. My point is, what happens if your starter goes bad in your 61 LeSabre? Are you going to find one? Probably, yeah, but it ain't going to happen tomorrow. You're not going to go down to the A&B Auto Hobby Shop or parts store and get a new starter. You're going to have to scour the nation's junkyards to try to find one. And that's why these aging aircraft are in the condition that they're in. So it's extraordinarily complex, and it's not something you just throw dollars at to fix. All right, let's talk a little bit about our newest service, the Space Force. They just celebrated their 5th anniversary, and they have a series of challenges, but for a different set of reasons. The fact of the matter is that even when they were stood up, it's underfunded, it's undersized, and they don't have the authorities to consolidate all the DoD space agencies that they ostensibly were stood up to provide unity of command for. You can see on the chart up there, they only make up 3.5% of DoD's budget. But everything, every service does relies on making sure that our operations in space are top-notch. Actually, the U.S. Space Force provides utilities for people around the globe. Most people take all this stuff for granted. You can't get gas from your gas station with your credit card without our GPS constellation, which provides precision navigation and timing. Same thing with going to your checking account. Same thing with those of you who invest in the stock market, which is really scary because, you know, if you don't get paper transactions, that's it. So now imagine what the military requirements are for providing communications, from providing timing and accuracy for GPS guided and precision munitions. So it's really significant that we give the Space Force the resources that it needs to do what? To protect its capabilities that, guess what? We launched into space when space was presumed to be a sanctuary. But the Russians and the Chinese have made it their case to move warfare into space. They actively have tested weapons. We know that. They're actively on every single day trying to disrupt our satellites. So what we need to do is provide the capabilities of the Space Force to be able to defend, and not just defend, but you know, the best way to take care of an adversary is through offense and to build those capabilities. With respect to personnel, there are multiple bases that any of our services have, that a single base is bigger than the entire Space Force. Kadena Air Base, Japan has more people. Fort Bragg, I guess we renamed it again, has more people than the United States Space Force. Eglin Air Force Base. Space Force active duty components less than 10,000 people. All right, you might say, well, you know, all right, they're growing, whatever. I was talking to Joe Saltzman, who's the Chief of Space Operations, a couple of months ago, and we were chatting about this challenge. He goes, yeah. He goes, Dave, you know how many nominal people are in each one of the service headquarters, Army, Navy, Air Force departments? About 4,500. Because you know how many we have? 600. Now, why that makes a difference is if you go to a meeting in the Pentagon and you're going to discuss resource allocation or some other important issue, and the Army, Navy, and the Air Force sends 4 stars, and the Space Force, they're tied up somewhere, they send a colonel, how do you think they're going to rate relative to the arguments that the other services make? I mean, it's pretty mundane, but it gives you an example of why people matter. And then there's the organizational authorities. That quote that you've probably already read was made by the Vice President. There are 60 or so departments or agencies. In the 5 years the Space Force has been stood up, the Space Development Agency did move from the OSD staff into this, and that's it. So the other 59 out there who are relying on, you know, what I call institutional resistance to change ain't moving. And the reason why this is important is not to change what these other organizations are doing, but provide them into an organization that can ensure unity of effort and unity of command. Okay. What's the impact of the 2025 budget? Well, the congressman knows this. I'm sure many of you in here do. There's not going to be a 2025 budget. There's a continuing resolution. I'm not going to bore this audience with a dissertation on why CRs are bad, but they are. What I put on the chart here is what the 25 budget, what the Air Force and the Space Force went in for, okay? And both of them end up with decreased top line when you take into consideration inflation. I got an example there in that 4th bullet. The Air Force budget request cuts 250 aircraft while only buying 91. And that's repeated in the next 4 years in the FYDP, Future Year Defense Plan. So, I'm not making up the fact that we're going to get even older, smaller, and less ready. It's in the frapping budget. And that's the way the follow-on plans go. I talked about the pilot shortage. I talked about spending. And so one of the reasons I'm talking to you all is to make you aware of the situation that currently exists, because that's the only way we're going to get change. But the Air Force today is in a death spiral, and it will ultimately collapse if we don't resource it appropriately to recover from this nosedive that it's in. Okay, what are the solutions? Well, here are my recommended priorities for the next Secretary of the Air Force, Troy Mink. The first one's obvious: reverse the decline in readiness and force structure, resource the Space Force for what it needs. And one of the biggest problems that's a little bit wonky, but I'm going to do my best to explain it to you, is that third one there. In the U.S. Air Force budget, there's $45 billion that not 1 cent goes to the United States Air Force. It's called pass-through. Why is this important? Well, first, I'm sure everyone out there is going, where's the money go to? You have to ask that to the Secretary of Defense, but it doesn't matter. It could go to buying potatoes. I don't care. It doesn't go to the United States Air Force. Why is this important? Because if you're a congressman or a senator and you want to know what's the allocation of resources going to the different services, you pull out the FY 2025 Defense Comptroller budget brief, and on page 2, it has a list of Army, Department of the Air Force, Navy, Army, OSD, Office of Secretary of Defense, defense-wide spending. And what you'll see is the United States Air Force is #1. And so people will go, followed by the Navy, followed by the Army, followed by other DoD-wide spending. And so people will say, what are you bitching about? You're #1. Here's the deal. If you go to slide 78, in the backdrop, which, Congressman, help me out here. I doubt you're going to go to slide 78 in the briefing. It does lay out the $45 billion not in the Air Force budget, but it's coded in weird language, Air Force blue and non-blue. Well, what does that mean to a layman? My point is, if you took the $45 billion out of the Air Force budget, what you would have ended up with was Navy #1, Army #2, other DoD defense-wide spending #3, and Air Force #4. Now, does that make a difference to Joe and Susie Q. Public when they're looking at allocation of resources? Or our congressional representatives and senators? Yeah, you bet it does. So, sorry for the digression there, but that's something that's very important. By the way, it doesn't take an act of Congress to change it. All it takes is the Department of Defense Comptroller to shift that money from out of the Air Force budget over to a line that says other DoD-wide spending. All it has to happen. But do you think the Navy, the Army, or DoD wants to see that change? No, because it raises them up on the target list. But it's something that needs to be done. All right, here's some more specifics. I'm going to provide a copy of the brief, so I won't spend a lot of time on this, but will hit the highlights. Fully fund the next generation air dominance penetrating combat aircraft. You saw that President Trump announced that. Now we just need to get it out there and fully funded. Increase the annual buy rate of F-35s and F-15EXs. You see the numbers there? Last year, we procured only 53 aircraft. You need to buy a minimum of 72 to stop the decline in the overall numbers. And if you don't do that, we're going to continue to get smaller. We got a B-21's going gangbusters. It's a great aircraft for the China threat that we face. So it's doing so good, let's double the production rate. Restore readiness, you got to increase the flying hours, but you also have to fund weapon system sustainment, the fancy word for spares. No spare, no fly. Right now we're funded at spares at about 80%, and needs to go up over 95%. We're all about supporting artificial intelligence, autonomy. Some of you have heard about collaborative combat aircraft. It's just a fancy word for an airplane that flies by itself without a pilot in it and can do some cosmic stuff. But it's still a proof of concept. We need to fund this capability, and hopefully it will help us because it recovers some of the number challenges that we have because they're not expensive as manned aircraft. And then there's building stockpiles of munitions. Ladies and gentlemen, here's one of the issues where you'll hear a lot of business folks talk about, well, what we need to do is we need to get more business people into the leadership in the Department of Defense because they'll apply their business principles to DOD. Doesn't work. Here's why. If you're running a profit and loss business, the manner in which you execute is very different than what's required to succeed in warfare. Humankind has not devised a more wasteful or useless expenditure of resources than what's required to win in war. Okay? So you have two completely different philosophies. Some of you might know who Fred Smith was. He's a founder of FedEx, and he had some great ideas with respect to just-in-time delivery. He brought them to the Pentagon. People get all excited. Yeah, let's do just-in-time delivery. No, as a war fighter, I don't want just-in-time delivery. I want mountains of millions of munitions stockpiled in every combatant command around the world. I don't want to have to rely on somebody to deliver me or, my friends in the Army's artillery battery 155 millimeter shells just in time. Ask the Ukrainians how that's worked out. And oh, by the way, speaking of industrial base, which we haven't yet, but I'll raise it, we can produce, I believe the numbers were on the order of 15 to 20,000 155 millimeter rounds a year until recently. What's the expenditure rate in the Ukrainian-Russian war? 10,000 rounds a day. How we doing? So we need to stockpile munitions. I've been in unclassified war games with respect to China's scenario, Taiwan Straits. Actually, I built that scenario in 2006, so I know a little bit about it in real world. But in unclass war games today, we run out of munitions by the second week. You can have all the ships and airplanes and armor that you want, but if you don't have any munitions, you're not going to win. All right, fully fund the Space Force programs, increase the personnel, consolidate the agencies. NRO, NGA need to belong inside the Space Force. Let's get serious. If you're going to stand up a service, let's make it useful. Establish a national nuclear deterrence fund separate from the Air Force and the Navy service accounts to ensure necessary funding is not offset by conventional forces. Why the Army why the Air Force and the Navy? Because we're the ones that the Air Force has two legs of the triad. The Navy has ballistic missile submarines. Nuclear deterrence is expensive. Okay, that needs to be recognized as a national bill, all right, so that we don't undercut the conventional spending that's necessary to make our Navy and our Air Force whole. Sentinel, you know about that. We need to get on with building another air fueling system, and mobility needs to come after this too. And by the way, those aren't my words down there. It's the 2024 Congressional Commission. All right, let me wrap this up. By the way, I want to emphasize, and it's absolutely true, that we have the most outstanding men and women in our military across all the services writ large. Absolutely. But to exploit their brilliance and their innovation and their intelligence, they have to be provided the tools, the equipment, and the training to make it all work. And that's the challenge that we have. Your Department of the Air Force is too small, too old, and not ready to execute our national defense strategy. It's only going to get worse if we don't fix it. And it's not going to be cheap. The Air Force alone requires an infusion of about $40 billion a year for the next 5 years, and the Space Force about $5 billion a year. If you want details, Google Mitchell Institute. I got a report, Vectors for the Trump administration on Air Force and Space Force. Because, and that's not hyperbole, if we don't fix that, we risk losing the next war. People talk about expense, but the only thing more expensive than a first-rate military is a second-rate military. Yeah, I'm pleased because you all understand that. And quite frankly, that's one of the biggest challenges that we have. How do you explain to an American public that for 30 years, all they've known is peace and prosperity? That all of that stands to crumble if we get into a conflict, particularly in the situation that we are today. I would have hoped that the Ukraine-Russia war would have woken people up. Maybe it did at the beginning, but then it sort of faded away. And people are talking about, well, my goodness, it's expensive. That's another subject area. But I want to give you all plenty of time for Q&A. Thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate what you do. Thanks, Soup, for inviting me here and having the opportunity to talk to these great American patriots. Thank you.
I got a microphone. This is the first question, Jeremy. I got a microphone. Okay. Questions out here? Here you go, sir.
Dave, that was great.
Did I steal your microphone?
Hang on just a second.
Here, why don't you use this?
Dave, that was great. We appreciate it. There's some really tough lessons here and some alarming lessons, even for somebody who's, I think, I'm pretty familiar with the stuff. And the one on flying hours was really, really scary. Let me ask you a question, though. This is kind of a softball, but what do you say when somebody says, how much money's enough? Because our defense budget is bigger than what the defense budgets of the total of the next 10 or 12 nations.
I thought maybe he brought you another mic. Well, first, thanks for the softball because, and I think you know by now I'm a pretty candid individual. When someone highlights that question to me, and this is not you, okay, but generally it's someone in Congress to go, oh my God, we're spending too much because the next 987 comes. That's an indication of the person asking the question's ignorance with respect to defense issues. Do any one of those next 7, 8, 9, 10, you pick the number of nations, is their national security strategy the same as the United States of America? No. So, the reason it's expensive is because our national security strategy is based on two fundamental tenets, and they've been that way over the last 30, 40 years. One is that we've elected to engage around the world with our military to shape and promote peace and stability. Now, that's not just good for those different areas around the world, it's good for us. That's in our best interest. But guess what? It takes money to build the rotational-based forces to station those people around the world to shape and promote peace and stability. The second tenet that has existed for a long time until recently, because no one spoke to highlight the issues of the resources that are required, was that we need to have sufficient forces to be able to fight and win in more than one regional major contingency at any one time. Because if you only have a one-war declaratory strategy and you get involved in the conflict, you're encouraging conflict on the part of somebody else, or encouraging aggression on the part of somebody else. So that's why we spend more money than the next 5, 6, 7, 8, you pick your number, nations around the world. Now, I get it. The subject is, it's expensive. Yeah, it's expensive to maintain that national security strategy. It fundamentally hasn't changed. So you either resource the forces to be able to do it or be prepared to lose, or you got a second option. We can redesign the national security strategy to fit the arbitrary budget that everyone decides, okay, that's enough. Do you all know that? I mean, the budget that we have for defense is completely arbitrary. It's not tied to the national security strategy. It's not tied to the national defense strategy. It's just what it was last year, except they add 1 or 2%. Do you think the threats, I've already showed you, do you think the threats have changed since 1991? Yeah. But what we haven't done is adjust the amount of money over time to deal with it. The third option is to continue to do what we have been doing the last 30 years in a row, and that's everyone in the military is, yes sir, we can do it. You give us a task, we'll do it. Except the significance of the threats today are growing such that we can't do it anymore. So we have to stop saying that we can. And then the fourth option, and this is the one I think is probably the most pragmatic, but it's also one of the most difficult, is given the resources that DoD currently has, and forgive me for using acronyms, but I presume everyone in here understands DoD's Department of Defense. We need to do an honest roles and missions review across all the services and figure out how we can better allocate the money that we have. All right? What gives us the biggest bang for the buck? Doesn't mean, and look, we still need to be able to dominate in land, sea, air, space, subsea, cyberspace. I get it. But we can allocate resources much more efficiently than the way we have them today. Who's resisting that? Every one of the services, because they all have something to lose. So it's a real challenge. That's a long answer. My wife says, don't tell stories because you always go on too long. Just go with the script. But
Well, that's a fair question, though, because that's one that comes up. As you say to somebody who may not be educated in the responsibilities we've taken on in the national defense strategy and national security strategy. It's a good question. Sir, did you have a question?
Yeah, here you go, sir.
General, I understand your personal great concern about the deterioration or the aging of the Air Force. But I, as an American citizen, are concerned about the security of the United States. So while the number of fighter planes in the Air Force is down, I don't know anything from your talk about the number of fighter planes in the U.S. Navy. And while the number of ground attack, A-10 in the Air Force is way down, I don't know anything about attack helicopters in the Army. Can you give us a more generalized situation with aircraft overall, not just the Air Force aircraft?
Let me, Dave, before you answer that, we're going to explore the other services. This is going to be an air-centric piece, but we're going to come back and get to your questions in the next couple of programs in the fall and the winter. So we haven't forgotten about that. It's a fair question, but just so you know, we're going to do that.
Yeah, but I'll be happy to. First, it's a great question. And it kind of goes to the last thing I said in the context of collectively we need a cross-service roles and functions review, okay? But point I'd like to make is each one of the services, except the Space Force, has aircraft. But the aircraft they possess are there to facilitate operations in their particular domain. All right? There's only one United States Air Force whose mission is to exploit the advantages of air and space to meet national security objectives and not dependent on everyone else. Because part of the challenges in this roles and missions review, and there are Marines in here that are very familiar with the Omnibus Agreement, but they retain their aircraft to perform their own individual service objectives. All right, so that's different philosophy with respect to, there are no Air Force objectives when we go to war. There are only joint force objectives. Now, what I'd tell you is the Air Force is a hell of a lot worse off in terms of aviation assets than any of the other services. So that's sort of a macro level answer. Other folks, Nasty Manazar will be able to speak to that. But hell, for years, the last 15 years, the Navy has procured twice the number of aircraft than the Air Force has. So they're sitting pretty.
Stand by one. I got a question
Okay.
card here. I want to
Here.
just stand by one.
Excuse me?
Let me ask this question first. Yeah, so this is a good question given our crowd here of cadets. And of course, we all know that the challenges recruiting has had for the last couple of years, thank goodness, thanks to folks like Lemaire and Steve Lemaire and his squadron, recruiting squadron, we're doing better. But here's a good question. Dave said, what advice would you give to a young person that's getting ready to go in the Air Force or the Space Force or being a Sea Cadet? What do you say to young folks today looking at the military?
You're not going to have a better opportunity at a young age to be exposed to responsibilities and opportunities that you otherwise would not get. From being able to exploit and learn about how to be a leader, you will be presented opportunities that you're never going to get early on in industry. And then, depending upon what and everyone has a perspective, depending upon what you signed up for and what you committed to, you'll end up making a decision as to whether you want to make this a career or separate. But the opportunity that the United States military provides, regardless of which service you go into, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, Space Force, is absolutely incredible, and nothing exists like it anywhere else. Okay, that's my broad answer. Now I'm going to give you an anecdote. So, actually, I think this is when I was working for you, General Burr, when you were a colonel, and I was a captain, and this is at Tyndall Air Force Base, and I'm an F-15 instructor pilot. This is like 1984. I was there 4, 5, and 6. And I can remember driving into work one day. I'm going down Highway 98, and the runway kind of parallels that. And there are a couple of F-15s coming down what we call initial. You know, they're coming down the runway to pitch out the land. And they're doing some construction work on the side of the road. And there is a construction guy sitting there with his shovel, and he's leaning on his shovel, and he's looking up in the air at those F-15s. And, you know, it struck me at the time. I'm going, that guy is wishing he could do that. Yeah. And I'm going, I'm driving into work to be able to go do that. And where else in the world is I don't remember how old I was, but let's say mid-30s, young 30s. Can someone fly at that time, you know, $30, $40 million jet that's the world's greatest air superiority fighter? Yeah, I'm not making $1 million a year, but there's no millionaire out there that's my age that could be doing this. And so, anyway, that's my point. And I'm still excited about it.
Okay. I remember going to Israel and buying a T-shirt, which at the time was kind of fun. It said, "Don't worry, America, Israel has your back." Okay? Now, I wonder about that, because the patriotism that Israel has, of course, they have highest amount of taxes because of national security as prime. What are we learning from this? Gordon Chang said that he said he was amazed that Israel has the powerful military that it has, that China is amazed. Tell me, what do you think that we can learn from Israel?
Well, actually, I just visited Israel. I say just visited. I spent less than a year, but I went over. I've been over there multiple times. Last time I went, I was pretty privileged because they showed me what was going on with respect to. I went with a couple of other senior officers from other countries, and we went through everything that they're doing. They took us to all of the sites of the atrocities that were committed against them, And oh, by the way, there's a big difference between reading about something and then going to a kibbutz and talking to one of the survivors who was there and told you in great detail how 60% of his kibbutz was murdered, and walking into their homes and seeing the names and the people that were there. And then I had the opportunity to go in with the 169th Division and travel all the way into Gaza along the border with Egypt, all 9 miles, all the way down to the sea, and we stopped at a variety of different locations and watched what was going on. And one of the things that struck me was, and Israel has the benefit of being able to do this because they are such a small military, but they truly integrate all of their forces. I'm standing there at the beach, and I see a ship over there, and they're UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles, drones, whatever you'd like to call them, flying overhead. And I got the deputy division commander telling us about how they incorporate all the different venues of information to be able to accomplish their objectives in the face of an adversary who uses Gazan civilians as human shields, and the extraordinary measures that they go through to protect them. But the point is, you still have to remove this scourge of Hamas. So multiple lessons in the context of how integrating the variety of different forces from whatever domain really works when you put it to the test. The second part, obviously you're very familiar with Iron Dome, and so there's a lot to be learned from that as well, but we also have to learn the right lessons in the right context, because you all have heard a lot about the president's Golden Dome. There's a great big, like, okay, we can just transfer what they did in Israel to here. No. You know, Israel's smaller than Delaware, about 6,000 plus square miles. United States, continental United States is over 3.8 million square miles. So a very different challenge. But there's a lot we can learn and have learned from the Israeli Defense Force.
Dave, let me take you back a little bit. You were one of the first advocates of providing F-16s to Ukraine. We've done that. What's your take on what we've learned, what the Ukrainians have learned, and what we have learned about that fight?
Got a couple hours. Actually, they're exploiting those aircraft very, very well. They all wish they'd had them 2 years prior, but the reticence of the last administration really let us down in that regard and gave the Ukrainians just sufficient numbers of weapons so that they wouldn't lose as opposed to winning, because if they were given an infusion of weapons early on, they could have defeated the Russians by now. But that's water over the bridge. So where are we now? They do have F-16s. They now have Mirage 2000s. They're incorporating these modernized aircraft into their force. They've already been highly successful in terms of air defense missions. Now what they need to do is transform and modernize their Air Force so they can actually begin to conduct offensive operations against the Russians.
Mark, question?
General, so the question of money always comes up. So you have the current administration saying everybody else in the world has to spend more. The question is, forget Europe for a second, because we have allies in the Pacific, we have allies in South America, we even have a few allies in the North African littoral on the southern Mediterranean. So the question is how do we get them to spend more, and B, what does it buy us in the way of augmenting our defense and our national security policy?
It's a great question. And again, I'll sort of answer it with an anecdote that happens to be real. When we fought in Desert Storm, we had 34 allies and partners that participated. And this is not to say that they didn't contribute to this, because all of them did. They contributed something to what they could do. But here's the reality, folks. We could have fought and succeeded in that conflict without any of those allies. without any of those allies and partners, except Saudi Arabia for providing the basing. But I mean, in terms of their actual participation. We had so many forces. I actually built an attack package second day of the war against a Tuwaitha nuclear site in south of Baghdad that consisted of 72 F-16s. That's how many aircraft we had. And by the way, I got called by the squadron commander the next day and said, Dave, please don't ever do that again. So we spend too much time trying to deconflict from hitting one another when we're rolling in on the target than we were on the target itself. I said, okay, I got it. Today, we don't have that luxury. We absolutely, if you look at the numbers, we absolutely need our allies to provide the force structure in order to posit a competent military operation, regardless of where it is around the world. I'll give you another example which highlights that, and it's one of the good things. All of you have heard bad things about the F-35. Look, people also tend to forget that the reason that advanced aircraft like this have problems is because they're on the leading edge of technology. People forget how many F-16 drivers we got in here. Okay, a couple, handful. Back in the day, there used to be a joke, if you wanted to own an F-16, just buy an acre of land off the end of an Air Force runway, because there'll be 3 in the dirt within the next week. All right, so, you know, they had a lot of problems. They're working them all out. They will. Now the F-16's one of the most successful fighters in the world. Here's the advantage of the F-35. Although it's a magnificent airplane when it comes to high technology and low observability, I was talking to General Hecker, who's the commander of USAFE last year, and he gave me an example. He said, you know, when we get all of our U.S. Air Force F-35s into Europe, we'll have about 51 of them at Lakenheath. The rest of the NATO nations combined will have over 600. Now, that's strategic value of the F-35, because by other nations, now we have upwards of 20 other nations owning these aircraft, it doesn't just bring our air forces closer together, it brings our nations together. So partners and allies today are absolutely vital to U.S. national security interests. That's why I'll just stop there.
Dave, I was going to ask you, in fact, we got a really good question here by email on that exact question of allies, but I think you've answered that. So I'm going to ask Scott, if you would. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I sure did. Thanks, General. First of all, I thought your talk was outstanding. It really was. At the very beginning, though, you said, you made an analogy towards World War II, and that was the biggest concern that we should be about our country and what have you. And you said, no, it's not World War II, it's right now. I would agree with you, just as a citizen. You're the general, I'm not. But the bottom line is, I think many Americans think that way. It's a concern for our friends, our family, for whatever. That said and done, my question to you is this. Anytime I'm involved in something like this, I always wonder what the speaker would like the take-home to be for all of us. You came here today to share a message. We heard about the issues with the Air Force needing more money, billions to have more aircraft. We understand that. But above that, the message that you want us to share with friends, with family, with our community, with anybody that we work with or play with or whatever, what's the message that we should be most concerned about when I go home and put my head on the pillow tonight? What's the number one thing that I should be concerned about? And then number two, me and all of us as citizens of this great nation, what would you like us to do, or what can we do as citizens to make it the way it should be?
Well, two great questions. The first one is the realization of the threats facing our nation are real. There is a very high likelihood that we will go to war globally within the next 5 years. That's what you should be concerned about, and making sure with your friends understand. Number two, and this is why I'm absolutely delighted, Mr. Congressman, that you took time out of your schedule to be here today, is to let your congressional representatives and senators know that there's a concern that we got a geriatric Air Force out there. And, I hear grumbling out there. I told you right up front, and I believe it, we need to have the strongest Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, am I leaving someone out? Guardians in the world. But there's no joint force operation that can be conducted without some element of the Air Force and the Space Force involved. Okay? And I hope you see that the Air Force is on a trajectory to go away. So what are you going to do about it? Or maybe the other way around it is, Congress needs to address this issue. And I know, I've made this argument many times before. Everyone out here has their own independent position on guns versus butter. It's been that way as long as we've been a nation. But you can't, I say you can't, I know there are people out there that will argue with the preamble of the Constitution, but my perspective is you can't argue with the preamble of the Constitution, because what it says is that we form this nation to, quote, provide for the common defense, comma, promote the general welfare, unquote. But we're spending as if those two statements were reversed. We got to fix that. Because the last thing we want is to get people aware of the significance of the threat when we go to war and we get our asses kicked. And we're spilling the blood of our sons and daughters, and everyone's going to go, well, why didn't you tell us? So that's what you can do. Increase awareness. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Dave, thanks for coming here and giving us your low-key, unvarnished views.
Yeah, I don't have any. I don't get too excited about this stuff.
And we appreciate it. I think it's a lesson we all got to take. With that, we'll terminate the Q&A piece. And Scott, are you ready to come? Okay, I'll turn it back over to Scott to complete. Just stay up. Yeah.